I would like to get us started. I'm Dawn Laporte. I'd like to welcome and thank everyone for joining us this evening for the book club. I'd like to also thank Drs. AJ Johnson, Chair of the AAOS Diversity Advisory Board, Dr. Marlene DeMeo, past president of the RJOS, Dr. Jen Weiss, Chair of the AAOS Communications Cabinet, Dr. Ida Brown, President of the Black Women Orthopedic Society, Eric Carson, who will be joining us, President of the J. Robert Gladden Orthopedic Society, Claire McDaniel, PGY3 resident at Johns Hopkins, and Dr. Sonia Sloan, Vice President of the BWOS, for your support and for being part of our panel. I want to talk briefly about why we're here. Following the social unrest in May brought about by the tragic events surrounding the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others due to the color of their skin, it became even more important to us and to promote and support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to act, to educate, and to influence change. I saw a post on Twitter from Dr. Sonia Sloan calling for intention and action. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew something needed to be done. I didn't know Dr. Sloan, but I reached out to her through social media to request a meeting in the hopes of some guidance. She agreed to meet and was incredibly gracious and patient. She emphasized the importance of having difficult conversations and of accountability and of educating ourselves. I can't thank her enough for pointing me and us in a good direction and helping to initiate some of these difficult conversations and create relationships and design webinars, and for frequently redirecting me. It has been an unprecedented year with the COVID-19 pandemic, senseless murders, and the Capitol insurgency earlier this month. However, we have a vaccine now, and we have a change in leadership of the country, and there is a fresh look to the future. The dialogue needs to change, and we hope to open that tonight with this book. We understand that this book, White Fragility, is a lot to consider in one evening, but we want to start the conversation and consider some possible solutions. Everyone brings different experiences and perspectives to the table. We may leave tonight with more questions than answers, and we may feel uncomfortable at times, but that's okay, and that's probably to be expected. So I would like to really thank everyone for reading the book and joining us tonight, and a special thank you to Dr. Sloan for helping to create and lead this book club, for giving honest feedback, and for pushing us to be intentional and to take action. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Sloan, who will give some ground rules for the book club tonight.
So by now you guys know the book, White Fragility. And for those that may not, that just wanted to get on tonight, we have a larger audience than even anticipated. And I believe it's probably going to grow as we keep talking tonight. So first, let's everyone take a deep breath and just relax. We are chartering on uncharted territory for an organization on this professional level to be speaking of such caliber of a book that challenges each of us individually, but more specifically an entire race is daunting, to say the least. So I commend Dr. Laporte for responding to my tweet, as well as trying to be intentional and be present and try to do something different. So for those of you, the slackers that did not read the book, let's go there. The brief synopsis of White Fragility. White fragility is a phenomenon by which white people become angry, defensive, and or hostile when confronted with the idea of complicit with systemic racism. In the book, Robin DeAngelo examines several origins of the failure of the white society to understand the structural nature of racism. It explores the history and the existent racial hierarchy and makes powerful case in which the incumbent of white people have to accept their individual as well as their collective responsibility for white supremacy and to do the difficult task that we're doing tonight, to challenge it. So let's start with some ground rules. First and foremost, if anyone comes on the line, somehow got into our Zoom room, please ignore them. If we have some chatter or something else that does come across, I think Ruth Jackson Orthopedic Society was very selective in trying to protect who could and could not get on tonight, to protect you in this open discussion that is very personal. Next, let's just talk about the elephant in the room. This is not personal. This is about racism. It is specifically about whites discussing racism, not just the individual level, but the systemic level that we all face, specifically in the practice of healthcare, and more specifically in medicine, and even most specifically in orthopedic surgery. So tonight, the primary goal is for white people working to understand racism, not to learn how racism impacts people of color. Understand? So here are the ground rules. If by chance we are talking and we're asking questions and people are responding, we want to make sure that we see none of these things. Distancing. Distancing is associated with, well, not me, or I know someone, or whatever. You have to preference your words, your comments, your discussion with I. Secondly, checking out. A lot of people may not want to discuss tonight. A lot of people may not make comments tonight, and that's okay. But you don't get to check out and say, that's not me. I've never done that. I don't know anyone like that. This is, again, is the whole systemic system of racism. And the point tonight is to meet with intent to identify how you can change it. The other thing we will not tolerate is dominating the conversation. I'm sure all of us as surgeons would never dominate the conversation. Trust, we will turn the mic off. Next thing is positioning. Positioning is about giving evidence where it doesn't apply. Do not use a situation in which you know you've never put yourself in and or you've been part of just to be part of the discussion. Positioning. There is one thing we talked about, Dawn and I specifically, is the idea of fear and hopelessness. That is very common in reading the book as well as in the discussion. I myself, I was already triggered with the idea of even having to be worried that the conversation may go awry, or some wrong things may be said. And Dawn and I have worked tirelessly on this to make sure that this is a comfortable, open discussion, but at the same time, very real and very firm and very intentional. So hopelessness and fear, anxiety, those are all part of this conversation because it's challenging to something that is so ingrained, and definitely on the heels of the previous administration. We have to deal with this now. And lastly, and this one's tough, expecting people of color to teach white people about race. That's not what tonight is about. I will be facilitating this conversation, but understand the book is called White Fragility, not Black Fragility. So I challenge you to be open, to listen, to engage, but more importantly, understand this is not about people of color. It's about a systemic racism. And tonight we're going to kick it off by opening discussion. So one of the first questions I wanted to pose is to Dawn, because she is the president of Ruth Jackson Orthopedic Society, and as well as she has shown the leadership to show her intent to try to change things. And Dawn, the question is, what does it mean to say that race is socially constructed?
Thank you. So race is not biological. There is no gene or cluster of genes that is common to all Black people or all white people. And that's why we say race is a social construct. It is a human invented classification system. It was initially designed to help distinguish physical features between people, but unfortunately has been more often used as a tool to justify oppression or violence. In this social construct, whiteness is considered an advantage. To be white is a privileged position in our society and its institutions. And white people don't have anything negative associated with them just because of their skin color. We're influenced by socialization, and socialization in many parts of the US presumes that white is the norm. And so many white people don't consider white to be a race. They consider white to be the benchmark against which other races are compared. Because race is a product of social forces, it manifests an influence on the class system as well. And so sometimes poor and working class individuals are not always considered fully white and don't always have the unearned benefits that come with that. And we talk a lot about structural racism, and structural racism is a system in which public policies and institutional practices support racial inequity. It supports the advantages of being white and the disadvantages of color, and helps those to endure and to adapt. And so an example of structural racism is something called redlining, which banks and real estate individuals would do. They would draw a red circle around neighborhoods that were with people of color, and the banks would not give them loans and would not support them. And so structural racism is a feature of the social, political, and economic environment in which we all exist. DeAngelo, the author of this book, talks not only about race being a social construct, but she talks about what racism is and what it isn't, and that everyone has racial biases. DeAngelo explains that racism is not intentionally hating somebody because of their race, and that racists are not inherently immoral. She says that racism is not prejudice, and it's not discrimination either. And this binary good bad promotes white fragility and upholds structural racism. She emphasizes that racism is not a slur, but it's a system. So it's prejudice with power. And in the US, white individuals hold institutional power. And when racial groups, collective bias is supported by institutional practices and legal policy, then it transforms to be racism. So in addition to race being a social construct, I think DeAngelo is trying to explain in this book that racism also comes out of our socialization. It's part of the system in which we were raised, and so it's inherent. And so it's not really a question of good or bad, but the question maybe should be, what am I going to do about it? Because it's here. And so that's something I learned a lot about in this first few chapters of the book.
All right, I'm not sure how we're doing the raising of hands if anyone else wants to interject that's on the panel about the socially constructed and racism. If not, Jennifer Weiss is the AAOS's communication personnel. She is definitely a woman that I know personally, so I know her character and I know her voice is sincere, and therefore putting her on the panel, I think it was to give a different light, that someone that is a little bit more enlightened and probably more judicious with their words. So question, Jennifer, is what does the author mean when she says white people are not, in fact, racially innocent? And or what impact would white people not knowing their racial history?
Yeah, I was honored to have you ask me to speak about this, and I want to go back to the piece, one of the rules of the road that has been tremendous for me over the last, I would say, 5 years, which is not asking my friends who are of color to teach me, but to educate myself so that I can come back and have a dialogue that's educated. And this book was one of a series that I maybe assigned myself, maybe Dave Brown might have given me some good direction. And so I had read this quite a while ago, and I went back and reread. And I can put, there's actually, she wrote this as an article in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy in 2011. And so it's kind of like a 12-page synopsis. So I read the book, but it's a nice resource for some people who might want to refresh their memory. So I'll just, and then what I will say is, the quote unquote innocence of white people, and not just what Robin DeAngelo has to say about this, but I'm going to go with the I in the rules of the road as well, sort of amalgamating the two. I was one of those people who, despite, I think, trying to educate myself for a long time, thought that it was racist to consider race. And I was one, and probably still am, one of those people who was taught at some points in my life that being colorblind is the goal. And as I had learned well before I read this book, but reminded in this book, how dangerous that is, and how that is really a cloak of innocence that contributed, I think, to actions from me and many of those around me. And I'm going to specifically speak about orthopedics that did not position me to be a good ally. I will say that the words that stick with me are that I can't identify racism and combat it if we make it invisible. And I also will say that I was one of those people who was brought up like with those around me telling me you're good, you're good-hearted. And so I thought that meant that I couldn't be racist. And as I read this book for the first time and brushed up on it, I was really impacted again by those words of how many people, and for those of you who don't know Sonia's husband, Dr. Timothy Sloan, he is a brilliant man, and we had some conversations about the importance of being able to identify something if we're going to work against it. And so this plausible deniability that, and I'm peppering in quotes from Robin DeAngelo because they're brilliant, and the aversive racism that she talks about. These are things that I grew up prone to. And being Jewish, I thought that was my minority. And I will say that one thing specific to the world of orthopedics and women that in my journey has come up a lot is I thought that I understood being a minority because I'm one of the 6% of women in orthopedics. And at some point, I recognized that once I left the AAOS meeting and went to the convenience store around the corner, I was no longer that 6% minority. But if I went with my friend Sonia, she still was. And so I shifted in and out of a minority, and that doesn't count, I don't think, or I've come to not think. So I speak as somebody who probably donned this this air of thinking I had this innocence that I didn't have, and I am really working now fiercely by trying to educate myself to move past that. And I will say that the other piece of the impact of white people not knowing racial history, it's disgusting when we don't know it. It's not acceptable, and I think that what I can do as a Jewish woman is liken that to somebody who grew up perhaps in Germany and wasn't taught about the Holocaust. I'm responsible for understanding my country and my history of our people, and it's not something that Dr. Brown and Dr. Sloan and Dr. Carson and Dr. Johnson should know about, but not me. That's a bunch of BS. And so my kids and I and my family are really trying to dig into this conversation. And quite frankly, I'm relearning history because I think it's important, and maybe learning it for the first time in a more correct way. Did I talk too long?
No, not at all. That was great. I don't think there's any wrong answers here tonight. There's no judgment. These are, our takes on the book, but it's also your feelings, your emotions. It's also what you bring to the table, which is going to help propel us to being the intentional and present. This summer, we were talking when Ruth Jackson Orthopedic Society and the Black Women Orthopedic Society, as we were forming, came together for a discussion, and we met with pretty much the leaders of both of the sides of the road to discuss, yes, the 6% of women.
Hopefully she'll be back with us shortly and then we'll resume, but I'll move on to the next question, which I was going to ask Dr. DeMaio, if you could share an experience, a time that you experienced your own white fragility or witnessed another white person's.
Yeah, it's interesting that Dr. Sloan was just about to talk about when the group of us all got together, and I'm sure she'll get back to that, but it's as a result of that conversation that I was really glad that you, Dr. Laporte, asked me this. So before I get to my answer, I just want to say for people that are not sure if they want to read this book or they have, that I think, you know, the author is really looking at things through compassion, so that we as human beings need to see through another's eyes, and that pain points are different for people. And we really just don't know, especially as professionals, you know, what other people's experiences are in life. And we really shouldn't have assumptions. But what she does characterize are groups of people, meaning us white people, and some of the things about our history that Dr. Weiss, that Jen was just talking about. And if you haven't read the book, it's really just trying to teach us to be sensitive as individuals, but also to be sensitive to groups of people. And there's a whole bunch of information in there about the patterns of behaviors and history. And I think that if you're not sure that there is such a thing as white fragility, if you look at this as through her eyes in that lens, you'll see that there really is, and that we've been defensive, especially since the civil rights movement. And we really have to understand what we're all about, and when we do make some big mistakes and miss things. So that's what comes to my example. So in 2015, you'll probably all remember that our colleague and wonderful friend, Dr. Bonnie Simpson Mason, won the Diversity Award at the Academy. And I was the youngest winner then, and I still think she's the youngest winner. And besides being the phenomenal person that she is, she was recognized by the Academy, thank heaven. And she's got a very interesting family. You know, her mother's an architect and construction engineer and all that. So why am I using that as an example? Well, this award came up in our discussion, and we did not recognize it at the Ruth Jackson meeting. And I even said that, I said, I don't think I was there. Well, you know what? I was there. And I didn't speak up. I saw her get that award. I made a point of being there, and I got a whole mess of people that I knew, because Claudia Thomas had won that award before. Dr. Wayne Southwick had won that award, and he had picked Dr. Thomas, and she was, as we all know, the first Black orthopedic surgeon trained in America. And I didn't speak up at the RJOS meeting. And people who know me, and even people who don't know me, know that I speak up. And I speak up to the extent that I have jeopardized my orthopedic career professionally, in the military, and in patient advocacy, trainee advocacy, other colleagues in their advocacy. I did not speak up at our meeting, and I was there. So after that meeting, I thought about it, and I looked up the stuff, and I was like, holy cow, I was there, and I was convinced I wasn't there because I would have spoken up. So I read White Fragility before we picked the book, and I tried to interpret what I did, and more importantly, what I didn't do in the context of this book. So what can I say? It was a type of white solidarity that went from what, like Jen was saying, I am a minority as a female orthopedic surgeon, but not in that room, right? They're mostly white women in there. I did not speak up because I didn't want to be disruptive. And it was happening in the back of my mind, I wasn't even aware of it. I still felt a little bit of an outsider in Ruth Jackson because I was a late joiner. I was kind of like recruited a little while back, and I kind of got into the officer business, so to speak, in the society very quickly. And it was really this sort of white solidarity thing. So I became a bystander, and I still cannot forgive myself for that. And I did that. So the book helped me understand that, and a bunch of other things, so that we can all be our best person, and we can all be stronger together. And I just assumed that somebody was going to say something about Bonnie Simpson Mason, and it didn't happen. And I was part of that problem. And I won't be that again. And if I am, I know after book clubs like this, people say something to me. So I can't apologize enough, except not to make it ever happen again.
I'm sorry about the drop off. We have new internet, so it failed nonetheless. But what I was saying, Marlene, was specifically like this summer, how emotional that you were with the discussion amongst our boards, you know, coming together as the leaders between Ruth Jackson and BWOS, and that you felt emotional and you were it was painful for you to listen to some of the stories that we had. I don't think you ever got the side from us, from the Black women orthopedic surgeons, which was, it was a trigger for us to have to talk about some of the trauma that we went through, specifically as residents. You know, I think even Dr. Weiss and I, years later. So to be present enough, great. And I hope more people do read the book, and you encourage more people to read the book. I think we have, the next question is for Jim Fickey, if he's able to unmute himself. Dr. Fickey, the opportunity and dilemmas of white people educating others on racism, opportunities versus dilemmas. Can you speak to that, sir?
I hope I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Sloan, and really all of you for this, for taking this on, and thanks for asking me this question. It's kind of a gut check to come here, because I look at this. I have a couple previous faculty members. A couple of friends. Dr. Johnson just conveniently just dropped off, but I guess he'll be back. But I would just I think AJ and I have been together for many years, since he started training, and I've learned a lot from Dr. Johnson. But what I cannot learn from asking somebody else's experience is the gut check that we ask when we actually have to listen and study. One of the things that I would say as a preface to the question is that when I read this book last summer, I actually read it after I read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And my white fragility was, I was taken aback by his strong words and his belief that he was a racist, and that racist ideas were prevalent in our society. And I just didn't see that. And so I went back and had a conversation with another one of my faculty members, and Carol Morris. And she said, well, have you read White Fragility? And I read that. And I, what I took back away from that is that we, and I, as a white male, need to listen, but I don't need to just listen. And Robin brings us up to say, look, don't just listen to somebody else's stories, study, learn about it, and get the history. And I think that Dr. DeMaio raised this issue. When we study the history, when we think about lives, I can't live an experience that I would never experience. I grew up with privilege. I got to go to a professional, a scholarship education I went through military, which to its credit allowed me to be in a melting pot where we kind of hung egos at the door, race at the door to some extent, but not completely. And so I felt like I wasn't fragile until I started reading the book. And I think the notion that she makes about getting educated is really comes to why you asked this question. I think first, as a white man, I have the opportunity to lead. I've been selected for positions all my life. And now I have a chance to, from that place, ask others and bring this to the attention of all of us and my other white colleagues, to bring this to our attention, to challenge and to really be provocative about this. And I think one of the key essence of this is that we cannot do it alone. I don't think that this is a dilemma or an opportunity. I think it's mixed, but I think that we have to do this together. And part of it is not just for you to tell your story or to ask somebody else to tell their story, but to figure out how that grabs us, what it evokes in our sensibility, in our sense of respect. And when we do that, then we can have a conversation. If we read books like Dr. Kendi's or another one that I will, our residents picked up and ran with was Black and Blue by John Hoberman. And that's another one about medical racism. And so we start studying these books, we study that way, and then we get personal perspectives. So I think and our goal is to teach each other how to be aware. The opportunity is to call each other out on it when we see racism, when we see this happen. And then our dilemmas are we cannot do it alone. And so we have to bring it into a forum like this. So I really think this is a great opportunity, and I hope I'm not too long with my answer.
Eric?
So Jim, I'm just going to say a quick comment here. I applaud you on the things that you're doing and trying to educate your residents. You are definitely stepping outside your level of comfort and maybe not knowing as much about some of these race issues. So the fact is you're stepping outside your comfort level, which is phenomenal, because I think a lot of the discussions we have about race, I say this all the time, are typically, and they should be, uncomfortable. There shouldn't be anything comfortable about this at all. So when I say that, I look at my chairman, Regis O'Keefe. I can tell you, he makes me uncomfortable because he is so passionate about diversity. He literally makes me uncomfortable sometimes. And it's because he's so passionate about it. Another person that comes to mind is Steve Frick. When Steve Frick was the program director at Carolinas, for Black History Month, he sat down and he had the residents write essays about Black History Month. Not that he's Black and he understands it, but I will give you, all three of you all, some props and tell you that you're woke.
Thank you, sir.
I like that. For the affirmation is good, definitely. And to get it from Eric Carson, even better. I'm just saying.
So we would say hua for that. I think it is but this.
There you go.
This can't be comfortable. This should not be comfortable. I think for us to move, we've got to step out of, quote, the comfort zone. So, again, thank you very much.
Thank you. You're totally right. I think that you guys still hear me. It's sort of like in surgery where we make jokes to be more comfortable, and or we laugh to try to be part of this. Whatever is going to get people engaged at this point, I think we're all for. We've got to be engaged at the next effort. Dr. Ida Brown has put in the link the book that you were speaking of, Jim, specifically the How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi. It's a great book, and that's definitely perhaps Dawn one for the read. Dawn, how would you like to proceed? There's a great question in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can actually bring that question up so that if anybody wants to weigh in, and then we can move forward from there. And I want to also add in that How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think, is a great next book to read after this, even, if you haven't read it before.
So the question from Dr. Leah Brown is, how does this information or new perspective influence how you will view implicit bias affects both Black physicians and patients? To panel. Eric's hand's still up. So does that mean you're responding, Eric? Or no?
I can always talk. I meant to take my hand down. But the question, interesting question, because, and I guess it really depends on your perspective. So example I'll give you is one of my partners literally was like in my face. I mean, he was like in my face beyond belief. And essentially it was related to the AOA chapter here at WashU deciding that they were going to put it on hold for a minute. And, he totally blind. I mean, I was involved with some of the decision-making. We reached out to the students. It was a unanimous decision across the school that there was some systemic racism associated with those students being elected to AOA. A lot of chapters around the country have really given this a lot of thought and are really trying to take a look at this. There's a lot of internal things. But anyways, he was like literally like in my face. I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they did this. This is all on merit. We work hard. We do all these things. And I'm feeling totally blindsided because he totally sees perspective in all this. And he doesn't see the bigger picture. He doesn't see the literature supporting that AOA has systemic implicit biases and unconscious biases, both towards women, Blacks, and Latinos. He just didn't see it. And he never really gave me a time to even speak. And I just was just like blindsided. So implicit bias and unconscious bias in regards to white fragility, it's real. And I have my moments when people have their biases, and I really don't feel like being bothered. I'm gonna be honest. And this was a moment when I was just like, okay, dude, believe whatever you want to believe. I'm just not gonna even entertain this at this point in time. And I said, and I had to take a step back and I said, well, I can't really let him slide like that. So I then sent him a couple papers. I said, let's get together, have a cup of coffee, and let's talk about this so you can understand my perspective, because all you hear is your perspective. So again, he wasn't seeing the big picture. There was a definite moment where he just still looked at me and he still didn't believe me at the end of the day that there are implicit and unconscious biases associated with those students elected to AOA. And part of it was he was AOA when he was here at WashU.
there it is. Anybody else on the panel want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just had a comment. So I'm a junior resident. I still take junior call. So I'm seeing patients for the first time in the ED. I'm the first orthopedic surgeon that they're seeing when they come to the emergency department with a complaint. And I was on call over the weekend. I hadn't finished the book yet, but I had started it. I was maybe 70 pages in. And I got 2 back-to-back consults down in the emergency department for rule out septic joints. One was a native joint and one was a prosthetic. And one patient was a white man, IV drug user, previous history of septic arthritis in that same joint, representing exact same symptoms. And the other patient, just a few doors down the hall, was a Black woman. She was 10 years after a total knee. She'd been doing great with her total knee with this insidious onset of pain. She had some chronic lymphedema and some cellulitis. And I found myself being so conscious about the fact that these were patients presenting with essentially the same concern, and that I was going to perform the same procedure on in the emergency department, which is a fairly painful procedure in arthrocentesis, and that I was careful in ways that I hadn't been prior to even reading this book, in order to educate both patients clearly, to validate their feelings clearly, to listen to their comments and questions equally, because I was trying to address this unconscious bias that I know I have and trying to be overt in overcoming that. And I think that there's a lot that we can do for self-education on a structural level, but when it comes down to it, and I think DeAngelo talks about this pretty well in the book, as well as like Ta-Nehisi Coates and some of his articles for The Atlantic, that it is not just this theoretical concept, that it is real pain and damage and death being inflicted at the hands of structural racism. And structural racism at a certain point does come down to individual interactions. So I was trying my best in the semi-educated place that I was 70 pages into this book to put into action what I was trying to learn.
Dr. Ide?
So piggybacking on what you just said, this is where the Ibram Kendi book really comes into play, because there's really two buckets, right? There's the bucket of being racist and there's the bucket of being anti-racist. And being racist doesn't mean necessarily saying the N-word or this, you know, caricature that we have of the racist white person and the pain they inflict on Black people, right? But really, a lot of what one benefits from, just how you were talking about, Eric, this meritocracy, or the meritocracy myth, as many say. With that myth, if you're benefiting from being AOA because you have these certain attributes, your color, your what socioeconomic status, perhaps you're the child of a physician, so you've been exposed to, I mean, there's multiple factors that go into deciding whether someone was AOA or not. But the point being that the step that the step that was taken by your friend, your colleague, is that was actually an anti-racist act to say, well, the act is to say, no, we are recognizing that this system is flawed. We're recognizing, we are seeing the structure, right? We're seeing the racist structure and how it discriminates against people of color for this honor, which definitely allows you to have access to certain fields of medicine, like orthopedic surgery, neurosurgery, et cetera. So what you're noting, Claire, is that you have this, that act, right, was you were actually being anti-racist, and recognizing that you may have had a bias there, and that you are now, since you're aware of that, you are making a conscious effort not to treat these patients differently, because you're recognizing that you have, and there's multiple articles on this, that within our medical education, we have ingrained within us racist concepts, right? We are taught that folks with sickle cell disease are Black, right? Patients with sickle cell disease are Black patients. Really, there is no biologic, right, distinction for Blackness. So that really is an adaptation that came to for because you have in areas that are, high incidence of malaria. So I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but rather I wanted to say that it's important when you recognize that there's white fragility, you're recognizing that this is an uncomfortable discussion. The really important step is to start being anti-racist and to start acting anti-racist. And we talk about, allyship, and that allyship is not just saying, oh yes, I feel you, I agree, that was a wrong, they treated you wrong. Like, that's not it. It's that when you're in the spaces you're in, to bring a Black person, brown person into that room, into that discussion, to reflect their views, and also so that you have a more diverse discussion. So be anti-racist.
Read the next book. We'll get it for you, Claire. And I think someone put in our chat, specifically, either one of these books would be great for journal club, book club, for residency programs for medical schools, because we know the implicit bias, unconscious bias is there, and the education has to be there. Dr. Weiss, you have your hand up?
Yes, I have, one of my books on my path over the last year has been The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And to me, when you bring up our treatment of patients and racial disparities in our healthcare and how we deliver it, I think that is a mandatory read for physicians, clinicians, actually just people. And I think that for me, in reading that book and understanding what how I'm perceived when I'm trying to take care of patients to my best ability, if I don't understand, it goes back to the question I was asked before, if I don't understand the racial history of medicine, I can't do the right job to educate my patients. And it calls to mind your husband's work with the vaccine education and interviewing Fauci, and just the education and the history, they have to go hand in hand if we are going to make an impact. So I really recommend that book. Helped me start to think about some things I hadn't thought about.
Awesome. All right. I think we will come back to some of the questions in the chat. The next question is for one of our resident, Claire, that you've already spoken, I think, a little bit on it, but what does it mean to say that racism is a structure and not just an event?
So this was a really interesting question for me, because when over the past few years, I've had this evolving concept of what is racism, evolving from what I was taught in school, for it was discrete events, and then civil rights movement, and then it was fine, which was essentially the kind of paradigm that I was taught. And then with the previous administration, it was easy to point to things like Charlottesville and say that's a discrete event of racism. That is racism right there, happening in front of me. And it was so easy for me to link it temporally to the new administration and say it never happened before that. This is a new thing, a new political movement. But the more I read about it and the more I educate myself, I realize that that's really just this kind of flare up of a symptom of a much deeper malady, which is this long-standing structural racism that, dating back to the 1619, like the 1619 Project tries to talk about. And I fell into that very easy trap of what DeAngelo talks about in her book of de jure versus de facto racism. And that I thought that once the de jure racism, the laws, the Jim Crow laws, and the true and legally enforced segregation was dismantled, that meant the end of those overarching institutional issues. And I failed to see the de facto racism left in place by much more subtle legal intricacies and the socialization as well. And so when we talk about structure, it's not pointing at like a single government organization that's causing it. It's this societal structure that flares up from time to time in these horrific events like Charlottesville, like George Floyd, or especially for healthcare workers, most poignantly, like Breonna Taylor. And I think that as it's so easy to be oblivious as a white person to the sometimes very subtle structural issues underlying all of those things. And racism is so much more than single events that make the news and have dramatic photos. It is pervasive, it is everywhere, and it is in almost everything we do in at least American society, if not society the world over.
In short, I wake up every morning Black and I go to bed Black every night. So racism is part of my DNA. It's part of what I deal with on a daily basis. It's not something I can even try to run away from. It's there on a daily basis. And being white and being privileged and being part of the majority, it's just not visible. However, it does become visible when you start talking about the gender inequities. And then I think you all as women can have a little bit better understanding of what it is to be singled out or not included. So there is a little bit of understanding there, but yes, you wake up as a woman every single day. You go to and you go to bed as a woman every single day, and you know the trials and tribulations that you go through. And so when I'm trying to express to, like, for instance, my program director here, when she's asking me questions, do you think that was microaggression? And I said, just the fact that you're asking me that question, you already know what it is. You're a woman, you've been through the experience, why you ask me this question?
Well, we'll lead into the next question that Eric is specifically about affirmative action. And what is the misunderstanding of the reason that affirmative action was necessary, and how does it reveal more about anti-Blackness?
Whew. Well, I actually did a little homework on this one. This is a deep, 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 deep question, because actually, did AJ and I talk a little bit about this at one point? I think we did get into this.
Yes, sir, we did.
Yes, we did. So the short version of the story is, I think people need to understand why affirmative action came about the first thing. That's the first and foremost thing. I think Claire just described it really well, of the Jim Crow, all the other various things that were going on, civil rights, and all these things that weren't creating an equal playing field. So as much as Ben Carson says that he did not benefit from, yeah, go ahead, look at her day. As much as he says he did not benefit from affirmative action, he did. And I will say that affirmative action during those times, which I would say affirmative action goes back to 63 with Kennedy, and then subsequently they brought the gender aspect of affirmative action to play in 68. So for that time, it's truly appropriate. In this era that we live in now, is affirmative action in quotas necessary? And I don't think they're necessary, but I think we need to take a very close look at how much progress we've actually made from the time that we talked about affirmative action to where we are right now. I would argue to say we've made this much progress. It really has not been in the progress that I think everybody thought affirmative action would be. I'm a product. I was born in 1960. I'm very much a product of affirmative action. I recognize that. I will acknowledge that. And I've then been able to take that a step further, obviously with my children, mentoring, sponsoring, that I've been able to not take away. Because the major thing with affirmative action, and again, I went to medical school. The first thing that a lot of my majority colleagues said to me, "Oh, you're here just because of affirmative action." And I seriously took I took offense to that. I mean, what I've done and what I've achieved should be acknowledged. And so affirmative action, in some respects, devalues our accomplishments, and that's where the struggle comes into play. Is that I think for the moment that we went to affirmative action, it was very appropriate of the times that we were in. I'm not a believer in quotas. I don't believe there's necessarily a need for affirmative action now. However, I would say I'm not sure that it's an even playing field. And that's where the problem comes into play. There's a great video where these kids are lined up on a line, and the guy says, "Oh, the first person to get 100 yards down there, I will give $100 to." And so then he starts asking questions. He says, "Every time I ask a question, either take a step forward or step backwards." And as he went through this whole scenario, he says, "Well, how many of you all are have single or no parent? Take a step backwards. How many of you all have 2 college-educated parents? Take 4 steps forward." And after he went through this whole scenario, it's a great video. You see the disadvantages that are put on the playing field, which do not allow this to be an equal playing field. And so I'm very sensitive to quotas, and I'm very sensitive to affirmative action for the fact that easily people use that to devalue your accomplishments. So I could go on and on and on about this, but that's the short version of the story here.
All right, any interjections here?
So I just want to jump in there. I think that the issue with even the discussion of affirmative action is that there are other quote unquote quotas, right? There are the number of athletes that need to be accepted to a school. There's the legacy, right? If you look at the numbers, more people have gotten into schools through legacy than any affirmative action for a Black or brown person. So it's important for us to recognize that there really is no meritocracy, right? Like no one is getting into college or med school alone on just their grades. Even we know that even the recommendations can have a bias within them or how they're viewed. We know that there's a bias when you see the name of certain people. So I think we have to just recognize that it's a meritocracy myth. So the concept of affirmative action really is one where you're addressing certain inequities. And great, the video's in there. But it's addressing certain inequities. And really, when you look at the numbers, I mean, Black and brown folks actually haven't benefited that much from affirmative action compared to other groups.
And Marlene, you were going to interject here?
Yeah, one of the things about the book is I do think it takes us to that next step from the implicit bias. And this idea of affirmative action is like what Dr. Carson was saying, is that's part of the chapter she goes into about the civil rights movement and how can we move forward after learning about all this and what do we do? And I think we need to move away from affirmative action because it does devalue us. And I felt that even in the military, you know. So my point is there's a thing called intentional placement. Like you had mentioned to Dr. Laporte, we have to be of intent and be doing action, which is different than affirmative action. So if you're going to have a panel and you want to have a good discussion, we want to have diversity, but how we define diversity depends on the panel and depends on who we're talking to. And if you have a group where it's important with STEM and medical students, and we want to show different people on there, well, then if you have two people that are equally qualified, but you want to appeal to the people that are there, pick the people of color, pick the LBGT people, pick whomever, and you can be transparent about that and not have a quota. And we need to do that more with and I make this plea for any kind of committee, any kind of presentation, any kind of board of trustees, whatever it may be, wherever you are, to keep this in your mind, to have intent and tell people about it, and they'll help you do it because we're all going to move forward with that.
That's
So
excellent, Led. Yeah, I'm just going to add one comment to this, and I know all of us are dealing with this within our departments in academia. When you raise the question of, well, we really need to look at diversity within our program, and I will tell you the number of nasty looks that I've gotten, and literally the comments that have been said. Like there was one person that commented in my faculty meeting back at University of Virginia. It's like, why are we talking about this? Aren't we past affirmative action? So there are people that equate affirmative action with diversity and trying to do the two hand in hand, and they're distinctly different. And as much as I sat there and I talked to this partner about this, these are two distinct entities, he did not hear me at all. Did not hear me. And he didn't want to hear anything about why we need to diversify the department. He's like, oh, we're past this quota and this affirmative action stuff. We already discussed this in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We're past that. Why are we talking about this now? And totally missed the point. Totally missed it.
So some of the questions that that our panelists are addressing are in response to some of the previous questions, and some of the questions that are actually in the chat specifically move beyond what the book club or book is for tonight. So we're not going to address Dr. Johnston's question specifically from a Black woman, specifically in medicine, Vieta Johnson, one of the first, and Ruth Jackson Orthopedic Society as well, about how do we move forward. That is the daily work she's talking about. And we'll talk about, as you read this book and other books, I think that's going to come into play, as well as Kristen Ross's comment about figuring out the constructive way to engage others and go on. That actually comes up later on in the chapter about the rules of engagement and how you deal with that on page 123. So those questions we want to address tonight in the chat, but we'll move forward with AJ's next question specifically. Can you guys hear me? Nod, yes, okay. AJ, discuss the suggestions for continuing the work of anti-racism. Which is the most challenging, and how can we meet some of those challenges, which speaks to some of the issues in the chat group?
Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm just going to fully acknowledge that I am a man of limited intellect. I'm just very happy to be here. I am also, I fully admit, I'm a plunger. I like to stir up stuff, so I like to be the center and bring up controversy for the sake of stimulating discussion. So take that into account. So I am going to frame my answer with my own experience. So my father was Black. He's from Tallahassee back when it was still segregated. Joined the Army to get out of Tallahassee. My mother is Korean. I was born in Korea. My first language was Korean, so English was the second language. I immigrated to the United States when I was 8. Went to El Paso, Texas. I look like this, but I don't speak English. Okay, nobody knew how to deal with me. Okay, if I was lighter skinned and I speak Spanish, I would have been Mexican. I know that's not the politically correct term now, but in El Paso, if you're of Latino descent or Latinx descent, you're Mexican, right? If you're dark skinned and you speak English, you're Black, but I didn't fit any category. Okay. Then I grew up in the military. The reason my dad joined the military in 1964 is that the military integrated during the Korean War in 1954, right? So I'm very proud of the fact that the military has a better record in race relations than any other institution in the United States. Sexism, not so much. LGBTQ relations, we all know that's not great, okay? Race-based relations, starting with Colin Powell and moving forward, hopefully the next Secretary of Defense will be the next step up, but I have benefited from that, okay? So much to the point that growing up, despite the fact that half my life was growing up in Texas, I actually believe that Texas didn't have any race-based problems, okay? This before I found out about Vidor, Texas. This is what I found out about Tyler, Texas. This is before I found out about Tyler, Texas. East Texas versus West Texas, North Texas versus South Texas, okay? So when you all get a chance after you watch the video about the take one step forward versus one step back, watch a little bit more lighthearted video from Key and Peele called Black Republicans, okay? It's a little, it's just more nuanced than it is, and it's about the dangers of thinking monolithic, right? Thinking about the Black experience or the white experience and so forth and so on. And the whole point of the story is that I went to West Point. I got my nomination from Senator Harry Reid. I am married to a woman that is a white Russian Jew from the Upper West Side. So I grew up poor and Black. My wife had the opposite experience, and my kids have had to navigate this self-identity thing throughout. So I am very, very proud of their college essays. My son is applying for veterinary school. This is in a senior year at UT. My daughter just got straight A's at NYU. So I'm very, very proud of my kids. So they have had to navigate this world. And this is something that Dr. Laporte and I have talked about, coming up with a webinar or some type of educational thing for the next step, I think, of the evolution of the discussion on white fragility and racism is intersectionality, right? Because the way we view racism or race in the United States, you have to pick. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Because of my personal viewpoints, I think a wide, big national levels systems are okay, but grassroots local levels that are sustained and longitudinal are more important. Events that happen in Washington are great, but they really don't affect me directly day to day. Things that happen in my city affect me every day, okay? So I got involved with interventions first, then I got involved with the Perry Initiative, and they are both very, very good pipeline programs, and I'm a very firm believer in pipeline programs. I benefited from pipeline programs. I got my Senate nomination for West Point because of Senator Harry Reid was a member of my church, okay? That being said, if you live in the west side of Austin or Westlake of Austin, you know, that's where some of the NFL quarterbacks Carson Wentz went to. Having a single touch point once is enough, okay? If you live in the far north side of San Antonio, which my kids went to, having a single touch point is enough. However, if you live on the east side of Austin or the south side of San Antonio, that is not enough. The day-to-day experiences that you go to work against you, okay? So I built here just not to toot my own horn, this is going to feed into my answer. A longitudinal, near peer mentorship based, starting in 8th grade, all the way up to medical school. So my residents mentor my pre-meds mentor my high schoolers, and the high schoolers mentor my middle schoolers. And I've gotten engagement from one of my schools is the Ann Richards School for Young Women Leaders. It's a STEM magnet school. And it is, and the official name of my program is called Project Team of Teams. Some of you have read my bio. I spent 7 years of my life in special operations. I've drank the special operations Kool-Aid. I think Sam McChrystal is an excellent leader. So that is going on. And when I present this at the National Caucus on the Movement and Life Caucus, people came up and asked me, and I'm talking about people of color, it is the pipeline for women in STEM and orthopedics, okay? And it is specifically designed for the low socioeconomic status, okay? Because when you talk about low SES, it includes everybody, but predominantly people of color. The number one question I get is, well, what are you doing for minorities? And then my response always is, why do you think I'm only targeting white women? Does a Black woman not count as Black? That's the problem with intersectionality. So that is the problem with monolithic thinking, okay? So having said that, now I'm gonna answer your question. How do you come up with anti-racism?
You took a long way, but okay, we'll accept that. Let's go.
Okay.
Speed it up here. No, I'm playing.
How do you go
Can you
against
put the program also in the?
So anti-racism is structurally going against the microaggressions and systematically going against the structural policies. So it starts with leadership. The chair of the DAB, the DAB's diversity strategy is geared on what the military did as a response of post-Vietnam. Recruitment, you have to have a targeted recruitment strategy. Identify who you want and target the recruitment strategy based upon the population you want. Retention, you can recruit all you want, but if you can't retain the population that you're trying to recruit, that's not going to work, right? Women do not apply to programs that don't have any women faculty. People of color do not apply to programs or rank programs that don't have any faculty of color. We know that, okay? Transparency. Dr. DeMaio was talking about. I publish our screening criteria, selection criteria, ranking criteria, okay? And I say it at the start of every interview process. And most importantly is accountability. You should be accountable to somebody else about the programs you put in place, okay? So that is the strategy for the DAB, that is the strategy for my department, and that is a strategy for our program. We also have built into my residency program a foundational leadership course that I teach, a 7-hour didactic course that we repeat every year, which includes bias training. That includes cognitive bias, logical fallacies, unconscious bias, feedback agility, because how you have the courageous conversations is it's got to have 3 things. Person giving the feedback needs to be in the right frame of mind. Person receiving the feedback needs to be in the right frame of mind, and then the environment needs to be correct, okay?
I think you just hit almost all 10 of the cardinal rules of engagement in dealing with the book.
Right.
And those mostly actually were part of page 123, 124, you guys, when dealing with how to engage. Right. And a lot of the programs and things that AJ has talked about that the Academy has tried to put into place are there, but haven't manifested the numbers yet. And so that's the other piece. I think even Jim Fickey in the discussion says, how do I educate more residents of color and enlist them? And he AJ, as well as Eric Carson and Dr. Ida Brown and Ruth Jackson. So we have the intersectionality of white, Black, male, woman, but each one of those is individual. How do we speak to each of those? And then speaking to that comes back to, again, white fragility. How are we dealing with the 96% of orthopedic surgeons that don't think like you, AJ, that don't answer like you, AJ, that don't always look like you, that are educating people like myself, Dr. Brown, Dr. Weiss, as well as the other females and or people of color that haven't read the book. And so I'll come to our last question because we're getting late tonight, and specifically, what are some constructive ways to use the emotional reactions when your opinions on racism is challenged? That's an open question to our panel tonight.
I would say apply those rules of feedback agility I just talked about. Just make sure that don't shirk the question, but if you're triggered, that's not going to be a constructive conversation. If the person's triggered, that's not going to be a constructive conversation, and make sure the environment is correct. I think that would be the best mental model to have these difficult / courageous conversations. Because I think one of the reasons why this conversation at the national level is so contentious is that we're not following those principles. And that's very, very hard to do. And one of my missions is to spread that word throughout all the residency programs to CORD.
That's good.
Okay, what I was going to say is that it really is somewhat contextual, because if you're a junior person in the hierarchy and you're talking to a senior person, it's going to be pretty difficult, and you may need to have someone intervene. So if you're a medical student or a junior resident, you may need to seek out your senior resident or your residency director or a staff person. Not because you can't speak up for yourself. It's just surgery is still very hierarchical, and you can have that conversation. If it's more of you're on the same level or close to, I think what everyone has said, to try to, like AJ was saying, take that conversation, and like what Dr. Carson did earlier, talk to him one-on-one. Have that discussion, set the ground rules. You may have to discuss those ground rules before you even have the conversation, and try to be positive. But it's hard to be positive. I mean, I think we all love America, but she doesn't always love us back. But there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope. And so you have to maybe have that conversation a couple times. What's really tough, I think, is when you have leaders that are not like people on this call and part of this panel. I'm not really sure what to do with them, because there's a lot of very, I don't know how to describe them, closed-minded people, or people that, think, this book and books like it is garbage. They're a problem, and there's a lot of them out there.
For me personally, I have to be in the right frame of mind. And Dr. Brown and Dr. Sloan can relate, because I'm not trying to wake everybody up. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy to get everybody woke. And I really have to be in that right frame of mind. I've had some discussions with like Bill McDade, who's the Chief Diversity Officer for the ACGME. And Bill gives these phenomenal talks. And Bill and I have been sharing some conversations recently. I'm trained to do implicit and unconscious bias training. And Bill and I have been talking a fair amount, and we are truly at a moment of saying, how effective is this?
It's not.
If I got 25, 30 people in the room, and I touch one person, I'll say I do feel good, but I'm looking around at the rest of the room. It's like, well, it's part of one of these modules. It has to be a check part. I have to do the check. And, I'm not a racist. And, is it my job to educate all these people? And it is, so that gets us into the minority tax, and from my perspective, my time and energy is far too much important to me that I have to be very selective in the people I interact with. And some interactions are a little bit confrontational because I feel I need to educate a person knowing they could care less what I think. And there's others who I think are truly good people that are interested in hearing what I have to say. So for me personally, it's really kind of selective because I'm not going to waste my energies on people who really don't care what I think and don't care about, books like this or care about diversity. I mean, it's just, they have their beliefs and they can live with them.
I think, Eric, you bring up a very good point, and that really circles back to the book, White Fragility. It is not our job as people of color to educate you, white people, about racism. And I'm saying that in a very blunt way because you have to understand that, in particular, as a Black woman in orthopedics or as a Black man in orthopedics, we're less than 2%, right? We're less than 1.5% of the field. So we are constantly exposed to commentary like, oh, turn that jungle music off in the OR. I don't like that music, meaning referring to jazz or to hip hop. Or, oh, is that patient an ay, ay, ay or an oi, 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 referring to pain, right? The perception of pain amongst Latino patients. This occurs all of the time. And for us as physicians of color, that's the environment that we inhabit, and it takes a toll on us. It's that minority tax. So it is not our job to educate our colleagues about it, meaning that we can engage in these conversations when we are able to, but really this is where we circle back to white fragility. It's the job of white people to have this discussion with one another so that we can truly have an impact, because ultimately, right, our whole goal is to take good care of our patients and to be good human beings. And you can't do that when you carry around implicit biases. And there was actually a recent study talking about implicit bias training that it really doesn't have much, it's not very effective in really addressing anti-Black bias in medicine. And really what's been proven to be more beneficial is encouraging they call it interracial contact, meaning encouraging positive interracial contact. That is what really helps to dismantle implicit bias. So those are my 2 cents.
That was good. I think this has been a great dialogue on this book. And again, we have not done the book justice in the 90 minutes or so that we have been on. But tonight, as we get ready to close out, I appreciate all of our panelists, but to the president of the Ruth Jackson Orthopedic Society, that we started this conversation on a Twitter chat, and we weren't banned from Twitter. I ask you, the final question is, how does the author of White Fragility challenge the idea that our intentions are what really count?
Thank you for all the great comments that just came through and in the chat as well. To the question about intention, do our intentions matter? DeAngelo says basically intentions are irrelevant. So it's great to be well-meaning, but it's much more important. What is the impact of your behavior? And looking at that and making a commitment to change what the impact is. And so intention, just because you're well-meaning doesn't mean it's okay. You have to look at how it impacts that individual. And I think that really changes your perspective, because I think I often say, well, I may have messed that up, but I meant well. So it's okay. They know I meant well, but that's not enough. So you have to look at how you can do it differently. And she gives a really good example towards the end of the book where she mentions something about some Black hair braids. And she offended somebody that she had been working closely with. And she didn't just leave it. She went and said, can we discuss this? I want to know what I can do in the future to make this better. What else did I not do? Could I have done better? And so, having the insight and the courage to say, I know I could do this better. Can you help me with that? And making those relationships is really important. So it's important to come, to make the effort to come to the table, to at least communicate. I think from this book, we know racism can't be avoided, but you can make an intentional effort. I can make an intentional effort to be better about it, take the initiative to educate myself and to develop authentic, cross-racial relationships, and to show that it's important enough to me to make the effort. I think that we need to follow through and try to interrupt the system of racism however and whenever we can. And it's way more than intention. It's about that action and effort and interaction.
Well, I think you all are extremely courageous, my majority colleagues. And I think you all are outstanding examples of persons who are working in a direction of being better people, of educating people. I mean, I think that is like so critical that as I start thinking through this, and I'm looking at my colleagues here, you all are phenomenal examples that I hope some of your partners and other majorities persons can see the reflective part of who you are, the insightful parts of who you are, and just the caring and compassion side of who you are, because this is really what it's all about. It has very little to do with what I say. I think Hade said it very well. It has very little to do with us. This is about you all. We get it. And no offense, we do get it, but I really get you all and the perspective that you're being very, very reflective and looking within and trying to make a difference, and in short, being an ally. And that's the most important part of the question.
So it's all feel good now, and we're all friendly, and we all are a commonality of the workplace, if you will, orthopedic surgery. But as you leave tonight, and the people that you will experience tomorrow, the places you go, the things that you will hear as the country is starting to heal, I think to my white colleagues, take this book, utilize it, because the words in it are phenomenal to help you understand where we are as a nation of color, that we're not necessarily a minority, but in orthopedics we are. And I think I would encourage you, again, if nothing else, to challenge the infrastructure, the systemic racism that you see daily. Challenge it, speak up, show up, be intentional. That's what this book was about. That's what tonight was about. And I hope, my hope and prayer is that at some point in 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it takes to make an orthopedic surgeon, that we'll have more faces like mine, like Dr. Brown's, like Dr. Eric Carson's. But right now we're fighting an uphill battle, and we need your voices, just like tonight, and well as the residents that may be on and other staff members that are white, to read this book, and then to read the next book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi. These are the things that are going to slowly start changing the conversations, the difficult conversations that we have to have. Dr. Laporte?
I don't think I could add anything better to wrap this up. I think everyone's making the effort to read the book and join tonight is a great statement, and definitely a step in the right direction. I've made missteps in the past, and I think this group is a great resource for moving forward and learning from each other, and encourage everyone to move to the next step, read the next book, and talk with your residents and your colleagues and your family, because this is just so important. Thank you, and thank you so much to all of the panelists. This was great. Have a great night.
Thank you. This is fantastic.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hugs to all.
Good night.
Hey, I still got love for you, AJ.
Courageous conversation. Bye, everyone.